I'd like to start off by saying that I don't have a clue why I'm posting this on X, or really at all. Maybe I'm afraid of dying or something. The events described in this story happened a month and a half ago, in Shenandoah, West Virginia, although I typed this up about 2 weeks ago. I haven't really had the guts to post this, until what happened yesterday. The story starts in late September, when my family went to go visit our relatives, who invited us up to celebrate one of them, Desiree, getting like $2,000 in some scratch-off lottery thing. They live in this really crappy part of Shenandoah that people from Charlestown, Shepherdstown, and Ranson, basically the least rednecky parts of West Virginia, like to call Squalor Holler. It's way up in the mountain, and exactly like how everyone pictures it when they hear about it. Nothing but ramshackle shacks, rusty rebuilt trailers, everything covered in decades-old Christmas decorations because they're all too busy being smelly rednecks to ever clean up. Real Deliverance stuff. Just no rivers or canoes. The relatives we were visiting are absolutely confirmed inbreeders. We don't refer to them as aunt, uncle, or whatever. Just relatives. Not terrible people or anything, just absolutely cartoonish, depressing hillbilly stereotypes. So, anyway, we're up here in this godforsaken trailer, and it sucks. There's like 8 of them, plus me, my dad, my mom, and my sister. About 2 hours in, my mom takes my cell phone so that I can focus on family time together, which is nonsense. All we did the whole time was eat TV dinners and be forced to watch NASCAR and stuff. After like 6 hours of this crap, about 10 minutes before we're supposed to leave, it starts raining. We know how treacherous the roads can get up on the mountain, so we decide to wait for the rain to die down. Flash forward 2 hours later, it's dark as hell, 10 o'clock, and there's a flood warning for the area. I have my phone back by this time, although no reception, of course. So I'm playing Tetris and Texas Hold'em, when suddenly I start hearing my dad losing it in the next room. I walk over, and it turns out that they let slip that they'd buried their kid, Thomas, outside, and apparently were afraid the rain would wash up his body or some other such thing. The kid was like 6, was attacked by a dog, and they never told the cops. Just friggin' buried him like he was a family pet. So my dad's flipping out, and rightfully so, because, we live in the 21st century and all. So our relatives all say they'll sort it out in the morning. My parents tell me and my sister to stay in the same room as them during the night, so we do. None of us really suspected that they'd killed Thomas or anything, since they are really peaceful. They didn't even own any guns, aside from this one old-timey double-barrel shotgun they had on a mantle. Nevertheless, we were creeped out and intended to tell the cops in the morning once we got to town. So it was like 3 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Power had gone out for the 5th time or so, and I wasn't able to charge my dead phone. Worst part is, I could see Thomas's little grave right outside the window. Little cross on it and everything. And I assumed the kid couldn't have been buried deep at all since they were so worried about him washing up out of the grave. So I was just fixated on it, kept being drawn to look out the window. And then I saw the worst thing in my life. Something was creeping through the trees toward the house. I stared at it for a while, but couldn't get a good look since it was raining and the brush was so thick. For a few minutes, I assumed it was 2 really pale horses, kind of ambling through the woods side by side. But then it walked into the moonlight, and I saw that it was all one thing, like a kind of human torso, but wider. It finally stepped into full view, and I saw that it had something like 6 legs, kind of somewhere between a beetle's and a horse's. 2 arms, right where someone would normally have them, but they were about half a foot longer than any normal man's arms. It had a bald head, but the face looked like some bizarre masquerade ball kind of mask. This clenched up, furrowed forehead, and a nose that looked sort of like a crow or a raven's beak. It didn't have eyes either, just like the depression where eyes would go. It looked like it had a human mouth underneath its proboscis. The thing moved sort of gracefully and made these soft, thumping noises when it moved. It must have been like 7-8 feet tall, but sounded like it weighed only 150 pounds at most. It started walking toward Thomas's grave, and then I finally snapped out of whatever trance I was in and just screamed. My mom was the first to wake up, and I told her to look out the window. She rushed over and didn't really seem to understand what she was looking at. After a minute, though, the thing bent down and started pawing at the grave with its hands. My dad and Jasper rushed in, and Jasper was just losing it, screaming like a little girl, then ran back out of the room, yelling for his father. "It's outside! It came and it's outside!" I look back and see the thing digging furiously at the ground, kicking up huge mounds of dirt. I hear these sounds of feet running around the house. I think they were looking for the shotgun. The thing reached into the hole and grabbed up what I assume was Thomas's body by the leg in one hand. The thing galloped back into the woods, snapping all these branches, and that's when we all heard it. A kid crying. The sound of a child sobbing and crying from the direction the thing took off in. We left as soon as the rain let up at like 5 a.m. I don't think we even told anyone at the house. Drove straight back to Ranson, only stopping for gas. No one said a word to each other. My family refuses to speak about what happened. I tried to bring it up once, just to make sure it was real. My dad told me to shut up, so I did. I typed this up about 3 weeks after it happened, but just saved it to a notepad file and left it alone. Never mentioned it to any of my friends or anything. Just tried to erase it from my mind by getting absolutely drunk whenever my thoughts lingered on it. It mostly worked. Up until yesterday. See, I work at this gas station in Ranson from 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. I work the register, keep the place clean, and take out the trash. Yesterday, when I was bringing the trash bags over to the back of the building for the dude in the morning to take care of, I heard what I assumed to be some junkie messing around in the dumpster. I yelled at whoever it was a couple of times to get out before I called the cops. But as I walked toward the source of the noise, I suddenly heard those same footsteps. That soft thump-thump. Hooves or feet or whatever the hell they were. I turned right around and went back into the store and hid behind the counter. I looked over at the outside security monitor and saw some kind of movement from just off screen. Something huge casting a shadow and moving. I caught a glimpse of, I don't know, an elbow or something? A pale limb darting in and out of view. It had to have been the same thing. I waited for it to leave, and after a while, it did. I woke up behind the counter at 6 a.m. this morning, to my manager giving me this look like I'm a drug addict or something. Went home and typed the rest of this up. Hey X, I'm not from here. I only come for the occasional creepypasta thread, and I'm not too into the paranormal. I've never believed in ghosts or aliens or any of that stuff. I live in Oak Park, just outside Chicago, Illinois. See, we have an ordinance here that you're not allowed to put up a for sale sign in front of a house. So many homes are vacant here that they'd be absolutely everywhere if we could put them up. So in order to ensure that people want to live here, We make it so it doesn't look like nobody wants to. Thus, no for sale signs. I live alone with my pet cat, an all-black cat which I found out recently is a rarity. His name is Calvin. He was the runt of the litter. This isn't really important. The story all started about 2 months ago. That's when I first got up late at night after a bad dream and went out for a cigarette, and saw my neighbor from directly across the street was sitting in front of his large, bright television, which was facing right outside of his window at my house. I didn't think anything of it. As days went on, I kept looking out my window and seeing my neighbor just sitting there watching TV. After 2 weeks, I came to the conclusion that he could very well be dead. It didn't make sense that he was just sitting there, TV on, not leaving the couch for weeks. I could only see the back of his head, and he may very well have moved while I was at work, but knowing it was there, the light of his television kept me up at night, and for hours on end there would just be no movement. I came to the conclusion that I should call the police to ask if they could check up on my neighbor. I didn't know him very well. We met twice. He was an older guy. I used to see him shoveling snow or raking leaves, and I'd offer to help, and he said no both times. He was a fairly active guy for his age, and it didn't add up that he'd just sit there for days watching TV and not leaving his house. So I called the police and told them, and they offered to check it out. I saw them pull up and couldn't help but watch. I was very curious, and even though I thought all that would happen was they'd call up an ambulance or something and remove my neighbor's dead body, not something I'd usually be extremely interested in watching, I had grown so curious about what was going on over there that I couldn't settle for the simple answer that my neighbor had simply died in front of the television. After knocking a few times, I saw them open up the front door and walk in. They looked around, and one of them left the living room, so I couldn't see where he'd gone. I could only see the one room where my neighbor's windows were. The one officer turned off the television and also left my sight. Then they both left and drove off. About 20 minutes later, I got a call explaining that the house was empty and my neighbor had moved out. They said a real estate agent had probably just accidentally left the television on. I went onto a few real estate sites and, as it were, the house was indeed for sale. Anticlimactic, but at least it was a far less morbid conclusion than I'd expected. I was sort of embarrassed that my mind had immediately gone to death when it really was so bland and simple, and I felt like a pretty bad person for actually feeling a slight sense of disappointment when I found out my neighbor hadn't died as I'd assumed. That was a reasonable answer, a totally logical one. I had no way of knowing without the real estate signs up front, and I had no reason to question it. My neighbor had moved out, plain and simple. When I went to bed that night, it had pretty much entirely left my head. My bedroom window faces out towards my neighbor's house. For the last 2 weeks, I had been watching the television from my bed. It was how I went to sleep, just confusedly staring in wonder, slightly disturbed knowing I could be looking at the back of the head of my dead neighbor. And since I had been staring at that television for the last 2 weeks, it took a few minutes to register the horror when I crawled into bed and looked at the television, still on across the street. I didn't sleep very well. Every night for about a month and a half, I'd just see that television. During the day it was on. I'd walk up to the house when I was feeling more adventurous and knock on the door, but nobody answered. I started smoking quite a bit in lieu of proper sleep. Every night I'd walk by the house, curious, scared, and confused. I contacted the realtor and asked if they were giving tours, and she said they were not, so it didn't get turned on during some open house. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, that the television was never on, but the officer definitely went over and turned it off, so it absolutely had been on. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, that the television was never on, but the officer definitely went over and turned it off, so it absolutely had been on, at least in the first place. I invited a friend over 2 weeks ago, and after a little hanging out, I told him the story and asked, straight-faced and horrified, if the television was on. He said that it was. He was clearly concerned for my health, and to be honest, I don't blame him. So the only other option I could think of was that maybe a squatter had taken up residence in the vacant house. It wasn't common in the area, as far as I knew. There's very little crime or homelessness in the suburban area I live in, so it didn't really make sense for somebody to squat here, but it was all I could think of. Last night, I worked up the courage to confront this squatter. I was going to call the police, but assuming the squatter had been there when I first called, I doubted it would do anything to tell them again. I'd worked it out in my head that so long as somebody else was living in that house illegally, it wasn't so bad for me to walk over and enter uninvited myself. Stupidly, I'd worked up this courage while smoking a cigarette late at night, where the only light out was the light pollution over to the east in Chicago, and the dim light of the street lamps. Shaking, both from the terrible cold weather we've been having lately, and from the nervousness taking over. I was hoping the door would be locked so I could back down on my sudden wave of courage and walk away without feeling like I was just running off with my tail between my legs. To my surprise and dismay, the door was not locked. I felt briefly confused, wondering why the realtor hadn't put in a lock like they did when I sold my house, but I realized that if there was somebody squatting here, then it shouldn't come as a surprise that there wasn't exactly airtight security. Slowly, timidly, I walked towards the living room. I could hear the faint murmur of infomercials and see the moving lights and color of the screen shine as I tiptoed, trying to make as little noise as possible. My whole body went cold as I entered the room. There was my squatter, a middle-aged woman, wrinkly, gray-haired, and dressed like a homeless person. It at least added up. I was more horrified at the fact that I now had to confront them than at the woman herself. I stuttered a scared hello, and she looked at me. And before I could form a thought, she screamed the most hellish, horrifying scream I've ever heard. It was not the scream of a middle-aged woman. It was demonic, deep and ear-splitting. I froze up, and my heart sank and my eyes widened, and I stared, accepting that I was going to die, at the screaming woman for what seemed like eternity. It was an unwavering scream. It didn't sound like she was losing her breath after what had to have been a whole minute. The moment the initial wave of shock wore off, I just turned and ran. She hadn't moved, save for turning to look at me as she screamed, and I looked to make sure she hadn't gotten up to follow me out, and she had not. I ran back to my house. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to explain the situation or risk getting myself into legal trouble for trespassing on my neighbor's property, and if they went there again and didn't find the squatter, there was no question I'd be seen as completely insane. I lay awake, refusing to look across the street at the television screen, and my thoughts raced. Surely it had to have just been a squatter. She looked like one, and she was clearly living in a house that wasn't hers. She was probably a mentally unstable homeless woman. I decided the scream couldn't have been as awful as I had thought. It was all just the makings of a scared mind. I actually managed to get some sleep, shockingly enough, and when I woke up, I briefly didn't even remember what had happened the night before. What I woke up to was somewhat odd. My cat always sleeps downstairs in the living room on the sofa, but I found him wide awake, sitting on my bed cleaning himself. In all my years living here, I never woke up with him in my room. I pet him a little and went downstairs. As I began remembering the events of the previous night, I decided to go out for a cigarette, and on my way out, I found that my front door had been unlocked. I ran through the last night in my head, and I remembered vividly my frantic run home ending in me making sure all my doors were locked. My memory is very rarely faulty. I felt my stomach churn and my heart sink, and I felt a chill as I walked back upstairs to my living room. What I found would have been entirely mundane in any other setting. My television set was on. I called the police to explain the situation. I called out of work and am spending the next few days in my friend's house with my laptop and my cat. I got a story. Been meaning to post this one for a while. This was back around 2006, early summer. I was just your typical 17-year-old kid. Parents moved around a lot back then, and we always ended up living beside large forests, woods, or prairie places. I'd done plenty of exploring, with and without friends. Tons of stories. But there's always one which makes you look back on it with no definite answer in sight, no matter which way you look at it. But this is how it went down. I played a lot of video games and watched a lot of TV. Taps was big in those days, and people respected them then. So you can see I was really taken in by the whole let's go ghost hunting trend. Near my house, there's this big urban forest, kind of like Central Park, split into 3 parts, Forest 1, 2, and 3. Through the years, I had a couple strange, unexplained events happen to me in them. Phantom smells, like lavender and roses, simply faded away as quickly as they came. At night in Forest 2, which had a concrete foundation where probably a house once stood, me and a few friends would see brief, bright flashes of light just erupt over our heads, with nothing over there for miles, too low for planes. It actually lit up the ground around us as if it were a hovering camera flash. Of course, now that I look back on it, it might have been a hunter's camera gadget strapped to a tree or something. That's one guess. Then there was Forest 3, which had a cemetery in it. I caught a ton of EVPs there, chilling ones. Most notable one, I asked, "Is there a heaven, a hell? Why don't you call for God?" And a young woman replied to me in a sad tone, "There is no God." So there was some freaky stuff going on there. One day I woke up early in the morning, between 4:30 and 5. I had recently bought this cheap $70 digital camera from Walmart and was extremely bored with it. So I figured an early walk in the forest should provide me with some unique pictures, which they did if you want to see them. Probably not, but they're all from this day and I'll post some. So I set out doing the same thing I've done probably 100 times by now. I'm jaywalking down the streets and, after a couple blocks, hit the forest entrance and dive in. I spend the next 15 minutes just heading to some known places and taking some quick snapshots. Taking a quick snap here and there. I take a few pictures thinking, this is gold, all the while forgetting that the whole entire wood is empty, silent, desolate as I had never seen it before. I usually run into 1 or 2 people by now, either jogging or walking their mutts, but nothing. It's a good day, I say to myself. Let's carry on. So I had this area called the safe zone. It's simply called that on account that it's wide and expansive with a little sand dune and a tall tree smack in the middle of it. So if you're under that tree, you can pretty much see all paths that string together Forest 1. I'm there, so I decide let's make for the lake. I pick a path from the safe zone and head for it. It's at this time I sense an eerie feeling in the air, like I'm being watched. I ignored it because, at that age, I wasn't mature enough to that point where everyone learns to trust your gut. Internal alarm bells ringing. I stayed calm and carried on. I hit the lake. I was tired from walking for like 45 minutes. The sky was gray and overcast, and there was intermittent drizzling. I parked myself against the ledge underneath the cover of some trees, and with a low battery on my camera, just decided to hang out while staring blandly out at this lake that, to my recollection, hadn't been swamped by a heavy fog 5 minutes ago. First time I've seen the place like this, I told myself. Then my eyes caught it from a distance. I was frozen. I see a person draped in a loose sheet, what looked to be a black tarp, and just simply spinning. Spinning and spinning around in circles in a pond bush of dogtails, their arms open widely as if praising something repeatedly. I'm simply there being as quiet as I can be, not moving an inch, barely releasing a breath, observing this mad person. This goes on for about 25 seconds, until the spin comes to an abrupt stop. I stare wide-eyed with thoughts racing in my head. What's going on? What is this? Should I? I'm thinking to myself, you got a camera. Don't be one of those idiots who doesn't capture the thing they so desperately brag about years from now. So with a low battery and bars practically invisible, I think, cheap Walmart brand camera, don't die on me. I reach forward and look up, and find him looking in my direction. I tell you, I saw no face. It was white, gray, whatever, like a doll. Was it a mask? I don't know, but I was terrified that I was discovered, pinpointed from my cover. It was so far from me, but it managed to see me in like 4 seconds. So I stared slackjaw, slowly lifting up my camera. In that moment, he or it lifts one white arm out of its tarp and points at me. Just pointing at me from a distance, as if doing some ritual gesture. Then his arm drops slowly down. I lifted my camera up. Snap. Another one. Snap. And battery officially dead. Then I got up, slowly backed away, and ran all the way back to the safe zone, and out a dozen trails and paths, crisscrossing to my exit. That was a crazy day, I must say.